been taking a look today at this concept of multi-generational discipleship. What it means that we are a church who makes followers of Jesus Christ who are then reproducing and equipping other disciples. We've looked at a couple of examples of that so far with the Thessalonian church and with a dude by the name of Apollos. But we see further examples of that in the New Testament. We see that taking place, for example, in the context of family. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, again in the opening verses of that letter to Paul's young protege, Timothy, someone he's investing in, who is having an influence in the lives of others, we catch a glimpse of how that has happened already in Timothy's family. We notice there in verse 5, "I have been reminded," Paul writes, "of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also." Here, in the context of family, we see generations, in this case, tied to the kind of age generations that we often speak of when we use that terminology. But Paul is wanting to encourage and exhort his young protege, Timothy, to make sure that he is having that influence in the lives of others and to allow God to ignite that in his heart, which will enable him to do that effectively. But in doing so, he calls to mind how others have invested in him. He calls to mind the fact that Timothy has a legacy of this being passed from one generation to another. He says, I want you to remember your grandmother. I want you to remember the investment that she made in your mother, Lois, in Eunice, and then think of your own mom, think of Eunice and the influence that she has had in your life. And then he goes on to say, for that reason then, I want you to make sure that you pick up the baton, that you are the one who has this influence in the lives of those who will come after you. In verses 6 and 7 there, he says, for this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. Paul says, now I want you, one who has the legacy of the investment that these others have made in your life, to now invest yourself in the lives of others. Allow God to fan into flame that within you, which will enable you to accomplish that. Now, I want to speak to our parents on this point, or our grandparents, because you have a special responsibility in this whole deal. As a parent who has a child, you are the one who is primarily responsible for helping to teach that child what it means to find and to follow Christ, to teach that child what it means to live for Him, and using the words that Paul uses elsewhere, to model for them what that life looks like so that it has a credibility, so that they've seen it lived out before them in the lives of others, and presumably then so that when the time comes, when they have that opportunity to make a decision to follow Christ, they understand already what that means. They know God's Word, and they have that best chance opportunity to be ones who will pick up the torch as the next generation and will follow Him. Now the church is here to partner with you. The church is here to come alongside as a cooperative partner with moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas to help that to happen. But I want to challenge you, parents, to take your responsibility in that very, very seriously. God will help us, but God expects us to step forward and be the ones who are actively and deliberately investing ourselves in the lives of our kids, teaching them what it means to follow Jesus. Now, when we think of this concept of multi-generational discipleship, whether it's in the context of the actual family, or whether it's in the broader context of the family of God, I want to challenge us with two things. One, the serious stakes that are involved in all of this, and secondly, the inspiration of what I believe to be the tremendous hope that's caught up in the math that is involved in this key concept. But first, the stakes, because what is before us is serious stuff, friends. What a failure on this has serious consequences. And we catch a glimpse of that, actually, in the opening chapters of the book of Judges, which finds itself in a point in history of transition in the lives of God's people. One generation is getting ready to die. The generation of Joshua, who has been a tremendous leader, and has guided them in the conquest of the promised land, the land that God had promised to give them. And in doing so, Joshua has had tremendous influence in the lives of his people, but that influence is now about to disappear with his death. But the description of this transition helps us glimpse just how high the stakes are in what is going on here. We read there in Judges chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, Joshua son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Eres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up. And notice what it says about this generation. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. You talk about a sobering reality. You have a generation who experiences the fruition, the fulfillment of God's grand promises for his people. But the next generation that is coming up doesn't know God and doesn't know from experience in particular, but doesn't know what it is that the Lord has done for his people. And if you read on through the rest of the book of Judges, you understand just how severe the consequences are for that reality. For the God's people find themselves in this constant cycle of falling away into the worship of false idols and false gods, and experiencing God's judgment for that, and then crying out for God. And God intervenes. He raises up a judge to be one who leads the people in being saved from the oppression of those around them. And then the people fall in to the same cycle again. Let it not be said of us, friends, that following us, a whole generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for his people. So the stakes are high. And I want us to be aware of our responsibility to make sure that we don't drop the baton in the process. But at the same time, I want us to see and be inspired by the tremendous hope that rests in this key concept of multi-generational discipleship. And this really, quite frankly, is where the math lesson comes in. And in this case, we understand that it's the difference between the concepts of addition and multiplication. Let me try to explain that a little bit further. If we think of it in terms of the way many people often think of the role of the church and of the pastor of the church, let's consider what it is if it's just Pastor Keith's responsibility to help disciple the person who is learning what it means to follow Christ. And so Pastor Keith goes out and he comes alongside one other person. And he invests in this person's life, and he teaches this person what it means to follow Christ and what it means to learn from God's Word and to live life as Christ has called us to live. And at some point, he feels like this person now can kind of go that on their own. They've reached a level of spiritual maturity where they no longer need help. So Pastor Keith goes out and he comes alongside another person. And he begins to invest in their life and to teach them what it means to follow Christ. And again, at some point, they reach a point where they too can kind of go this on their own. They've reached a certain level of spiritual maturity. And so Pastor Keith comes alongside one other person in all of that. And so with 3 generations in all of this, Pastor Keith has helped 3 people come to know what it means to follow Christ. And if we include Pastor Keith in that, at the end of 3 efforts, we have 4 people. But what if the people who are following Christ grasp this notion that it's not just the pastor's responsibility, though it certainly is, but it's not just the pastor's responsibility to be investing in the lives of others, but rather, what if this time Pastor Keith comes alongside someone and he invests in that person's life and teaches that person what it means to follow Christ and explains the ways of God to that person. And at some point, that person comes to the realization that they are maturing now spiritually, and they recognize that one of the true marks of discipleship is that each follower of Christ is investing themselves in the lives of others. So now they kind of decide that it's time for the next generation, and Pastor Keith goes out and invests in someone else. But this person also invests in someone else, and they come alongside them and teach them what it means to follow Christ. And at some point they reach that point of spiritual maturity where they understand that each of those people also is to be investing in someone else. And so Pastor Keith goes out and invests in someone else. This disciple goes out and invests in someone else. This disciple goes out and invests, as does this one. So that in 3 generations, instead of having just 3 disciples who have come from that, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and if we include Pastor Keith in that, we've got 8. So from 3 to 8, and if you begin to explain that or work that out beyond multiple other generations, you begin to see the potential impact that the people of God can have in the world if they grasp this idea, that it's not just this person's responsibility, but it's the calling for each follower of Christ to be investing themselves in the lives of others. Christian Schwartz and Christopher Schock try to paint the potential for that picture with an analogy to a pond. Imagine, they say, a water lily growing on a pond, and the pond itself has a surface area of 14,000 square feet. Now, don't worry about the numbers. You're going to get the idea here in just a minute. But the leaf of this particular species of water lily has a surface of 15.5 square inches. And each week of the year, each leaf reproduces itself in one more leaf. So at the beginning of the year, as the sun begins to warm the waters in the spring, there is one water lily leaf on the pond, 15.5 square inches on 14,000 square feet of pond, one small leaf. Now after 1 week, there are 2 leaves because each leaf reproduces itself with one more leaf. So after 1 week, we have 2 leaves. A week later, there are 4 leaves. And if you work out the math in all of that, after 16 weeks of these leaves reproducing themselves in one more leaf, exactly half of the water on the pond would be covered. Now here's the math problem. How many more weeks will it take for the remainder of the water in the pond to be covered by water lily leaves? Will it take 16 more weeks? No, it will take exactly 1 week. 16 weeks to get to that point, 1 more to cover the entire pond of water. After week 17, there would be 131,072 leaves covering 14,108 square feet of water on the pond. You see, friends, that's the potential. If God's people could begin to grasp this concept of multi-generational discipleship, each follower of Christ investing themselves in the lives of another, helping them come to know what it means to find and follow Christ, over the course of time, the impact on the world, our pond, would be unbelievable. Now see, I can get excited about that because I begin to think about what the impact could be on this area of the city we call Waynedale if the people of Avalon grasped this idea. I begin to get excited about the impact that we could have on the city of Fort Wayne if the people of Avalon, if the people of Vibe get this idea and really begin to invest their lives in what Christ has called us to be, to live out our calling of helping each other find and follow Christ. I get excited about the impact we can have on our world if we really get this idea. You see, many of us are here this morning because someone got that idea, and someone invested in our lives. They helped us find and follow Christ. They taught us what it meant to live for Him. Now the question for us will be, will we be that someone in the lives of others?
I was hurting and someone showed me Jesus' love.
My life felt hopeless until someone shared hope.
Someone who was a good friend and helped me follow Jesus.
Someone who gave up their life to help me.
Someone at school.
Someone in my neighborhood.
Someone who I fish with.
Someone I have coffee with.
Someone that I can have a good conversation with.
Someone I met at my daughter's volleyball practice.
Someone at my home.
Someone who likes me for me.
Someone who doesn't judge.
Someone who loves unconditionally.
Someone who will teach me to know God.
Someone who believes in me.
Someone who will show us how to live.
Someone who will guide me.
Someone who will help me follow Jesus.
For me, that someone was my friend Lily, who helped me follow Jesus more closely.
That someone, my friend who discipled me, was Kendon.
For me, that someone was my friend Chuck.
For me, that someone was Antonio.
That someone was Bruce.
That someone was Lucas.
That someone was Amy.
That someone was Henry.
That someone was Demetrius.
That someone was my grandparents.
That someone was Terry.
That someone was my Sunday school teacher.
That someone was my friend Liz.
That someone was Bill.
That someone was Matt.
That someone was Darla.
That someone is my dad.
Will you help me follow Jesus?
Will you help me follow Jesus?
Will you help me follow Jesus more closely?
Will you?
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 Will you be that someone?